We're rolling.
Yeah.
Tell us your name.
Ryan Antes.
Give me your name, your rank, and the year that you served.
Sure, Ryan Antes. I was a corporal in the U.S. Army with 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment from 1999 to December 2003.
So you're in Afghanistan first?
I was. We went over there January or February of 2002 through, I think, July of 2002. Did a tour in Iraq after that, whatever month or two before the invasion through, I think, July, August again in 2003.
Okay, are you talking about the 2013 invasion?
No, the 2003 invasion in Iraq. Yep.
This is mostly about Afghanistan. You were there still during the revenge factor of the...
Yeah, it was definitely the early, very patriotic days.
Right.
Looking to get back, strike back at the folks that took out the World Trade Center.
Yeah, so you had a real good cause.
We sure did. It was interesting. I remember we were doing a training mission outside of the U.S. We'd spent 6 weeks in Germany, and on 9/11 it was midday when all of this went down, and we immediately got locked down and started packing our bags because the plan wasn't clear, but we figured they were sending us to strike back against somebody pretty quick.
Yeah.
It was the good thing and the hard thing about being in the Ranger Regiment. You knew you were going, and you knew you were going quick.
Right. And so where'd you go?
So from there, we actually didn't end up deploying. Our one of the other, so 3 battalions in the Ranger Regiment, and 3rd Battalion got the privilege of jumping into Kandahar. I think it was still in September of 2001. Might have been early October. And then we simply rotated out. My company got to go in that early part of 2002. We initially deployed down to Kandahar, and then pretty quickly moved up to Bagram, which was just outside of Kabul, has made all the news lately. But back then it was a largely dirt road and old Russian installation and airfield. Not a lot of U.S. troops back then, and kind of living in the dirt. It took us a while to even get tents out there. Nowadays, I guess it's, or before we left, it was might as well be any modern kind of major base that might as well be somewhere in the U.S.
Yeah. What's the altitude there?
4,000 or 5,000 feet, I believe. We, from there, ended up kind of going up a ways. Spent a lot of time out in the eastern part of the country along the Pakistani border, 7,000, 8,000 feet, kind of running around looking for bad guys.
That's a tough altitude to be lugging a bunch of stuff.
It sure was. It was a bit of a culture shock. Fort Lewis in Washington, where we were stationed, was at sea level. Luckily, we had a little bit of time to kind of adjust before we really moved up to the 7,000, 8,000 foot range. But we spent most of that tour out there, and you know, it's hard at first, and then it gets easier. You start running around, and after a while, when we came back, it was a nice change being back at sea level.
Right.
All the extra oxygen when you go for a run. Hard fighting, but
Cold too?
yes, the winter it was snow on the ground, especially when you kind of got up to elevation. Down in the lower parts of the valleys, it was pleasant enough, but that was a pretty cold, bitter first winter. I think I might have seen worse a few times, but not too much. It's up awful high.
Yeah. I did some elk hunting in Colorado. We were at 11,000 feet, and walk from here to that lap, and you got to take a little break.
It's amazing how quickly everything becomes very difficult.
When do the helicopters have trouble?
Usually right up above, I guess it was around that 7,000, 8,000 foot mark, we started having to load up people off. We ran a mission to recover a downed helicopter pretty early on that I think was up over 15,000 feet. The Chinook, which is pretty much the big workhorse in the U.S. Army for carrying men and equipment, our joke used to be that at sea level, the max load on the Chinook was 1 more on exfil, and up there it was 4 men. You took a bunch of lifts to get guys up there, and you spent a lot of time with not a lot of support when you're trying to offload folks, because the air was just too thin to get the helicopters all the way up.
Wow. So how many usually all?
I don't know what the official policy was on it, but our joke was always on exfil when you're calculating them out was one more. I think it was somewhere from 40 to 45 guys you could cram into the Chinook when you're doing training missions at sea level. Up there, 4 guys was our limit with all our gear.
Wow.
There were...
How many guys did you had? How many trips was that?
Shoot, I think on that particular mission we took something like 30. So we had a bunch of aircraft, but I think it was 2 or 3 lifts to get everybody up there.
So you had trouble with Biden's speech. Not that you heard the speech, but you were anticipating him saying something that you weren't going to agree with. It's
been a bunch of mixed emotions, I think, watching the way that the U.S. has left Afghanistan. While I think it's hard to argue that there's a great need to perpetuate the war endlessly, I think there's a sense that for those of us that fought over there, that there was certainly a better way to end this particular chapter in American history, and to have what we've witnessed over the last few days, especially considering the deaths of those 13 Marines, described as somehow a successful operation. Because of the kind of constraints of modern politics, it's a little difficult to see that and to reconcile what we've been seeing back here and what we hear from friends who are still kind of in the military and in the know with a successful or a well-planned and executed departure from a foreign country.
How long do you think it would have taken to do it right? Or do you think the planning was just wrong?
I think the planning was a little bit wrong from the get-go. I think that kind of announcing to folks, or calling them the enemy, I suppose, after we signed a truce is disingenuous, but certainly adverse to our interest and the interests of our real allies over there. Setting a date in stone on the calendar and planning your withdrawal, and the withdrawal of all the support from the people that we've been supporting and training for 20 years, kind of giving that advanced intelligence to the enemy, is doesn't strike as a great plan. Maybe there was no better way to do it, but it certainly looked like we did what we could to hand the Taliban the...
It certainly accelerated their attack, right?
It certainly did. I mean, they were in Kabul and around the airport before we got everyone else out. You'd hate to see it described as us leaving like a thief in the night, but at the same time, if this was an anticipated imminent danger for our allies and interests in the country, it might have behooved us to be less open about how and when we were planning to leave, and to leave more support in place so that you didn't see kind of a vulnerable mass of troops centered around a couple of gates trying to get civilians and American citizens through. It's hard to watch.
Yeah. What kind of activities were you involved with in Afghanistan?
So a lot of the time we spent kind of patrolling out in areas where we expected Taliban activity and looking to get into firefights. We'd take different sections of various valleys across kind of the eastern and northern parts of the country. And
the green zone that they talk about?
Yeah, there wasn't much of one back then.
Okay.
It was, calling it kind of American or Allied held territory was a little bit difficult. We expected enemy presence. These valleys were not necessarily openly hostile. You didn't have a kind of conventional fielded force arrayed against us, but you did know that there were certain spots that if we kind of drove a convoy of American vehicles through, we might be able to get someone to come out and want to fight us. There were other folks that kind of had the hearts and minds mission and trying to get the local warlords and leaders to to come over to our side. We spent a little bit of time conducting raids and going through various villages where we expect a large enemy presence and trying to get high value targets out of those places.
So you were looking for trouble.
We were looking for trouble. That was the Ranger Regiment's mission. We did airfield seizures, and we did a lot of these kind of directed raids and ambush kind of activities. Go find the enemy and close with and destroy them.
Were IUEDs a big deal at that point?
No, that came much later. Most of the explosives we dealt with were your conventional mortars and rockets, and these were holdovers from the war that the Afghans fought with the Russians at that point. A lot of landmines. That was not a particularly pleasant surprise when we were up there.
What does that do to a vehicle?
The vehicle, depending on what kind you hit, it wouldn't do a whole lot. The Humvees are really designed to be able to take an anti-personnel mine. At least that was the line they told us. Never got to see one blown up while I was there. I've seen what they do to people, and it's not pleasant.
Is that still a problem over there? I guess probably is. Huh?
I presume so. We spent a lot of time watching guys whose whole job in the military was to look for and destroy these things, go after them, and I don't know that they ever got all of them or felt that they did. There were a lot of landmines in that country.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you hear about groups that are still fighting the landmines. They're standing on them.
It's awful once you realize that they're around you. You have no idea sometimes until something bad happens, and then it's a very different world. A lot of pucker factor.
When you found trouble, was that always an engagement, firefight?
Yeah, they were usually short-lived. Early on, we had a pretty strong tactical advantage over the people we were fighting. We had better equipment. We were trying to draw people out by operating during the day, but our biggest advantage was at night. And we were going on raids in villages to get a high-value target. They couldn't see us coming, and there was a sense of invulnerability, I think, in a lot of the early days in the darkness, simply because we had the technology that they didn't. Talking to the guys that stayed in and continued to go over there, I know that evaporated pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And at this point, it's they've managed to figure out where their combat multipliers are and how to take advantage of where we don't necessarily match up so well against smaller, more nimble forces in the field.
When do you think that changed, and why? How did they get better weapons? So many of them are American-made, I guess, right?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think that it was a tactical advantage, I think, more than the technology, at least early on. I know by, 2007, 2008, guys in my old unit we were taking heavier casualties and we were getting into more dangerous firefights. But it was, they figured out the tactical advantage of using IEDs. If you can set off an unexpected explosion very early on in the firefight and choose your ground, they were ambushing us in the ways that we'd been really good at ambushing them. Folks, it seems like it's real easy to underestimate your enemy when you're talking about a less technologically sophisticated culture or region of the world. But these people aren't stupid. They may not have the benefits of a formal education, but the bad guys were just as dangerous. I mean, I guess if nothing, they proved that with the execution of the plot on 9/11.
Yeah. And again, I guess you had more of the time you were there, you had more of a sense of righteousness. Like, we're gonna go out and catch the people that did this to America. And America was behind it a lot more, kind of fizzled it. People get tired of a 20-year war.
Yeah, well, and the mission changed at some point. We went from revenge, or I think technically it was a war against terrorism and the idea of terror itself. And that's hard to sustain for 20 years, and it became a matter of nation building and trying to protect the government that we had helped establish over there for good or for ill. And you never really root out the enemy in a place like Afghanistan. It's kind of a warren of caves and cities where it's a little hard to tell whose side everyone's on until they really declare against you or for you.
Yeah, I mean, how many nations found that out?
We're at least the third in the history of the world.
Well, Great Britain.
Russia, yeah, well, fair point. Russia and us.
Somehow France didn't get involved this time.
That's a wonder sometimes, isn't it? Right? It usually seems like they'll tread that ground. Maybe they're next.
I think they had a little bit of a presence there, didn't they, through NATO? Or?
Yeah, when we were over there, I think we had French, Canadian. It was French Foreign Legion, British soldiers. We had a bunch of SAS up in the regions we were in the early days when there weren't a lot of Americans. So,
what motivated them?
I think coming to war with us, right? It was the sense that when the attacks on 9/11 occurred, it was, I would imagine, hard for any of the Western nations to see it as not an attack so much on just the U.S., but as an affront against kind of Western modern life and the freedoms that we enjoy, or at least that was the easy narrative. And it made sense to want to support that effort, lest it kind of happen on their shores. Right. And I mean, France and Britain have both unfortunately experienced not anything quite on the scale, but certainly their share of terrorism in the last decade.
Yeah, well, everybody was our friend for a while there, huh?
There was that. Some of that faded by the time Iraq happened, I think, so it dissipated quickly.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of cynicism took over after a while, and especially the weapons of mass destruction. Was that 2013?
2003 was the we spent it was a large part of the mission was looking for these things and not ever finding, I guess, what would have satisfied the description of a smoking gun.
Right.
I think we felt like we'd found it once or twice when you come on these mustard gas caches, but it didn't count apparently. So. I still remember General Schwarzkopf's quote when France decided not to go with us over to Iraq. And I think he said something to the effect of going to war without the French is like going deer hunting without your accordion.
I don't remember that. It's a good one.
That was a pretty good one.
How aware were you of American politics when you were in Iraq? Or Afghanistan, for that matter.
Honestly, when I was young, I think I'd always registered or failed to register with any particular party. I'd thought of myself as independent in my high school days. I suppose I was fairly conservative and generally of a Republican mindset, which was the general tenor of the Ranger Regiment back then. I think the older I get, the more my views have kind of grafted back to the middle. At this point, I think I view myself as a Republicrat.
Okay. That's pretty rare. Most people are one way or far the other way.
I think we still need a tax code, but other than that, I think I might be libertarian, and I don't quite see burning it, because asking people to just contribute the right amount for all the things we need to do isn't going to happen.
So whatever the current administration was at the time, you were there for Obama.
It was still actually President Bush. By the time I got out, it was still George W. Bush. He was actually in the Army when the Bush versus Gore thing was happening, and we were in Ecuador training at the time, and we thought it was just the delay in information trickling down that we didn't know who the president was. So. They were odd times, but I was over in Afghanistan for the initial blast on that and for the whole mission accomplished in Iraq, but it didn't bring us home. We were still there for a long time after. Went through most of that deck of cards.
So was there cynicism among the troops about Iraq?
No, at least not in my unit, but the Ranger Regiment's always been kind of happy to find a fight and be of use.
Right.
It's the motto is sua sponte, so of their own accord. And it's an organization you have to volunteer your way in kind of 4 different times. You have to volunteer to join up with the Army. You have to volunteer for Airborne School. You have to volunteer to join the regiment. And then you have to volunteer to go to Ranger School afterwards. And it's not the kind of place that people go and then hope not to get into a fight.
Right.
So it was very easy, and it didn't matter who was president, to simply be pro whatever the mission is and kind of to stay on target. The regiment's always been good for that.
What made you enlist?
I was kind of ready to do something different, and I'd grown up in Long Beach and wanted to kind of get away from home and liked the idea of, being able to pay my own way through college afterwards. And I kind of shopped around. I didn't have a big military history in my family, so I didn't have anybody to ask, and it was pre-Google. I ended up going down to the recruiting office and took the Armed Forces Vocational Aptitude battery test, scored pretty decent on it, and they said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, what do you have? And they said, well, you could be in intelligence, you could be a mechanic, you could work with computers, you could shoot guns and blow stuff up. I said, that sounds good, I'll do that. And they said, that's infantry. And I said, okay. They're like, that's usually for guys that don't score so well. And I said, well, sounds good to me. And they said, do you want to jump out of airplanes? And I said, nah, I'm scared of heights. And they said, it pays extra. So I said, how much?
And how high?
And then they said, well, we'll give you a Ranger contract. And I said, what's that? More shooting guns and blowing stuff up. You'll figure it out when you get there. And away I went. And you go through the process, and after infantry training, you go to Airborne School and learn how to jump out of a perfectly good airplane, which is a little bit frightening. And then back then it was the Ranger Indoctrination Program, or RIP. It sounds like an unfortunate acronym. So we go over there and they give you the whole Ranger history, and there are 3 Ranger battalions, and one was in Fort Benning, Georgia, where I'd been training. That's 3rd Ranger Battalion. 2nd Ranger Battalion was on the West Coast up at Fort Lewis in Washington State. And 1st Ranger Battalion was down on the beach in Savannah, Georgia. And we got kind of towards the end of the course, and they figure out I was graduating, and they give you a little list, and they say, all right, rank your choices, write your name and roster number. And I went right down the list. 1, I'd like to be on the beach. 2, at least it was West Coast. So that was my 2nd choice. And I was kind of tired of Fort Benning, so I figured I'd pick that 3rd. They collected them all up, and we had a formation out on this blacktop they'd had for us. We got out there, and they have this giant burn barrel set up, keep a fire in the winter to keep warm. Big fire going in it, despite the fact it was kind of a warm spring day. And the instructor dropped the bag of choices in there. He said, that's what we think of your choices. Do push-ups for being stupid. You go where we tell you. So I was up at Fort Lewis for 4 years.
So you got it anyhow.
I ended up in Washington, so it wasn't so bad. I didn't end up staying in Fort Benning, Georgia. So
That's on the coast?
it is. It's just south of Tacoma. Now I guess they merged it with the Air Force Base, so it's Joint Base Lewis McChord these days.
Nothing like Pendleton, though.
No. Or Savannah, which was, it's a heck of a town.
Not the birthplace of hospitality or something like that?
Something like that. It's certainly a pretty city.
Yeah. Rangers probably more of a tight-knit group than most
Yeah.
most squads, and
It's
I guess most people stay together throughout. Anyhow, don't they? If you're in the infantry, don't you stay with your?
yeah. So the way it's funny because you always keep waiting for, is this the group I'm with for good? You think you've got it when you go to basic training and you go through all the training stuff, but then they kind of move you on, and it's really when you get to your final duty station that these are your guys, and this is kind of where you come up. And for me, that's when I got to Washington. I still have a couple of friends that I went all the way through basic with, but for the most part, it's the guys that were in my company back up at Fort Lewis that I'm still close with, and it's adversity that I guess builds those kind of bonds. You do a fair bit of suffering in training, and then you go through combat together, and the benefit of the shared experience is that you always feel like you pick up where you left off with the guys, even if it's been more than a decade. I've got friends that I don't see but every few years or call, but longer than that. And it still kind of feels like it was yesterday when we were kids together.
Yeah. Any of them commit suicide?
A lot. I think I've lost more friends to suicide than combat at this point.
Wow. What was the stat per day?
22 is what I'd heard.
Yeah, 22.
It's a little bit staggering when you think about it. And then again, it doesn't necessarily seem so strange, right? If you're kind of have gone to the extreme of being willing to volunteer and do these things that are dangerous and risk your life, solving a problem with violence, even if it's against yourself, doesn't feel like too much of a stretch, unfortunately. And I think that's where a lot of guys kind of go with it, sadly. I've lost a lot of people that I never thought I'd lose that way. Had a very good friend who was kind of big in the intervention circuit, for lack of a better term, always kind of active in social media. This guy's down, like, hey, we need to reach out to him, go and make sure he doesn't harm himself. And then a couple of things went badly in his life, and he took his own life by surprise. It was not a good day.
They generally use firearms?
Mostly hangings, a fair bit.
It's tough.
It is. The firearm thing makes sense. The hanging, not as much, but not many of them go for pills or
Tailpipe.
sling the wrist. No, it's certainly in with the violence, out with the violence, I suppose.
Have you wrestled with that at all?
The quote, so to give the lawyer's answer and duck the question, I think so, but the quote that I'd heard early on that helped me was that suicide doesn't remove your burden, it just puts it on someone else. And having known a lot of people that have done it, I think that's true, and I can't imagine doing that to my friends and family. And I mean, we all have our hard times, but you pull through, and it seems like giving up on that doesn't quite sit as well. A lot of, at least for me, the experience of getting into the Ranger Regiment was simply being tough enough not to quit. Like, there's a limit to how big, strong, and smart you are, but tough is on you. And I'm a little guy when I joined, but like, I knew I was tough enough to take the beating and not give up. Kind of apply that to civilian life and to everything it throws at you thereafter, and suicide doesn't seem like a good way to me.
What do you have for a family?
Wife and 2 kids, 9 and 7. And then both of my parents are still with us. My wife's dad too. I have 3 brothers and a sister, and they're all local, and I think that helps.
You see them?
I do, pretty regularly, about at least once a week. My sister's usually at my house, and I go visit my folks on the weekend when they're in town. They sometimes travel now that they're retired, but everybody still lives nearby.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Big family.
Yeah, it's funny, we didn't start out that way, but kind of turned into it. And
Good.
an advocate of family is what you make it. So I've got all the friends that we're not necessarily blood relatives with, but we've holidayed with for so long that kind of extends your network. Yeah. Right.
Where do you live now?
Over in the Wrigley district.
Okay.
Yeah, when I was young, I thought I wanted to leave town, and then I saw the world and realized everywhere else was too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, and I'm your typical Long Beach kid that now doesn't ever want to leave.
Right.
If they had a law school here, I would have gone.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I was born here. Never left. Guys your size, I'm not going to say you're little, but they seem to do well in the SEALs and the Rangers and whatnot. They're, I have a friend who was tried out for the SEALs, but he's like 6'4" and weighs close to 300 pounds. I mean, he's a big, strong guy,
Yeah.
but he just couldn't crawl under things or lift, do 100 pull-ups.
Well,
Could lift his body off the ground.
I joined, I was 108 pounds. I ran cross country at Long Beach Poly, and we won state my junior and senior year, and I was the slow kid on the varsity team. But you kind of have to get bigger, and I guess there's something to being tiny and being underestimated and tough. And I remember kind of showing up with the Ranger contract and basic training and listening to a bunch of guys that were bigger and stronger and tougher than me tell me how they were going to make it, and I wasn't. And I liked watching them quit.
I mean, is it harder to be big to go through the
You know, I don't know. It was certainly tough, kind of being a small guy carrying all that weight. A lot of the difference, at least with the Ranger stuff, is that it's heavy. It's a lot of walking, and you need the endurance. But it's hard being that small and then kind of carrying your own body weight proportionally. So you kind of get bigger, and then you get old, fat, and lazy. At least that's what I found. I got to my current size, but no, I think. At least the mindset for me made all the difference. I was used to being underestimated and was happy to do it and happy to prove folks wrong. I just didn't like the idea of quitting.
Yeah.
After a while, it becomes, I guess, part of your personality.
What did your folks think about you enlisting?
They were not thrilled. There wasn't a war on or anything at the time, but
Always a chance.
right there's always a chance. My dad didn't just missed being drafted in Vietnam and was very much of that era and kind of anti-join the military, make something of yourself, do something with your life. They were proud and supportive once I joined, but they tried pretty hard to talk me out of it. And in the end, I kind of did it anyway.
Did the recruiter help you at all? Did he talk to your parents?
He didn't help the way you'd think. I think the fact that my mind was made up sold them on it anyway. I did feel a little bad for the recruiter when I brought him home to explain to my folks what I was planning to do.
That's when you told your folks?
Yeah, I think they'd had an inkling that this was something I was thinking about, but it was a little bit of a surprise. I'd toyed with the notion of going to West Point or the Naval Academy, and when that hadn't quite panned out, I think the anticipation was that was it for my idea of being in the military, and enlisting certainly wasn't something they thought was on my radar.
Yeah. So how old's your dad?
Gosh, so 60, the late 60s, 67, 68?
Okay, I'm 66. I remember riding my bike down to, I've told Thomas, I was riding my Stingray down to the liquor store to get a paper to find out what my draft number was.
Yeah.
But at 66, it pretty much fizzled out by the time.
Yeah, he was kind of only really in the mix for a little bit, and he didn't end up going. So we didn't have a long military legacy in my family. My mom's dad had been a radio intelligence officer, so the backseat in a jet in the Air Force, and
During which war?
Korean, I believe, and he. By the time I came along, he was struggling with his own demons. He'd suffered from manic depression and schizophrenia, and was a wonderful man when he was around, but most of the time he was in the VA hospital and kind of in a locked ward. So not a lot of military support necessarily before I joined up.
My family is very weird. They were the wrong age. My grandfather was the wrong age for World War I. My dad was the wrong age for World War II. I was the wrong age for
Vietnam.
Then I have a son, but there's no draft. He's not going to enlist.
Yeah.
He's in his 30s. But do you think the Afghan or Iraqi conflicts were worth it? Worth what we lost in terms of lives and money?
It's hard to certainly say yes when you think about the price tag in lives. Though I think all told, we lost fewer soldiers in the last 20 years than folks we lost in 9/11.
That's 2,000 something in Afghanistan, and I don't know what the total for Iraq was over all the various campaigns.
It was pretty small, if I recall correctly. But I think that the thing that it's hard to discount is the fact that really since 9/11 we haven't had an attack on the scale that we saw on September 11th. And I think that there's a large part of that is our presence kind of overseas in Afghanistan, which had long been a haven for interests that were adverse to ours and for hatred of the West. Could it happen again? Well, sure. Will it I don't know, and I hope not. But in a lot of ways, it felt like having our soldiers doing their jobs and being in harm's way, which is certainly how I looked at it when I served, protected the U.S. and protected us from experiencing that level of tragedy again.
But didn't our actions in those wars increase their recruiting at least?
Maybe. I think that having seen some of the rhetoric and seen some of the things we saw over there, the ingrained hatred for the West based on nothing more than the freedoms we had is an easy recruiting tool in a place where you can sell using religion that this life is awful and all it takes is this one small act and you and your family will be taken care of in the afterlife for all time.
And the virgins.
Right, the 72 virgins. I think when you have little to look forward to this go around, it's going to be easy and will continue to be. And sowing hatred for the West isn't a hard message in portions of the world. We have a lot of things that they don't, and not the least of those is freedom. And if you look at the Taliban, the way they treat women, and it's insane. I saw an interview not too long ago on one of the cable news networks that they were interviewing some of the Taliban leaders about, women having a right to vote in their society. And they laughed at the female reporter and said, well, we don't give the dogs a right to vote. And it's a hard mindset.
Yeah. They're sort of indicating they're not going to be like that anymore.
That's the end of, that might be the end of freedom in Afghanistan, at least for a while, unfortunately.
Yeah. So you do think it was worth it then?
I think so.
All things considered.
It's hard watching something like this end without a clear condition for victory where we can say, like in World War II, right, to walk with your head held high, that all of these things we did in a very manifest way kind of worked out to be for the benefit of the United States. And we've gotten revenge and we protect our shores. There were good things we accomplished over there. We've had 20 years of, I guess, kind of a terrorism-free, well, not entirely terrorism-free, but large-scale terrorism-free life in the U.S. I think that by eliminating Osama bin Laden, even though it took a long time, you took a rather kind of great mastermind for the enemy cause off the board. And I think some of the lesser-known guys that you don't hear about as much, it probably struck the same level of blow. Will it last forever? No. But having fought over there and having lost friends during and because of this, I feel like there's no way I'd be ready to admit to myself that it wasn't worth it, I guess. Maybe there's arguments to the contrary. I'd listen, but I don't know that I'd be willing to hear them. And I think I'd spread the same message to the guys that are out there that feel very down about how things ended up. Time will tell.
How much does that feed the suicides, the fact that we didn't win, whether we lost or not, we didn't win?
Right.
I mean, I don't know the statistics for other wars. I can't imagine World War I vets not killing themselves. That was the PTSD from World War I must have just been off the charts.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that the outcome's determinative, right? I mean, people, from what I've seen and from the guys I've lost, people kill themselves for a variety of reasons, and I don't know that feeling down about the way things turned out factors all that high into it, right? I mean, even if, as you look over the 20-year stretch of our time in Afghanistan, it doesn't feel like a victory. We had moments I felt like to be proud of when we were fighting over there. We certainly had our own victories, petty as they may have been, or as little as they were to make the news or to even be told amongst anyone beyond our circle. There are those things that you can look back on and hold your head high about it. And at the end of the day, fighting alongside guys that you come to care about and to love, like it's its own reward. I hope it doesn't factor into it for too many folks, that they feel like because of the view of the outcome decides that their life isn't worth living anymore.
Well, if it's not that, then is it just a loss of the camaraderie and or is it the culture shock of coming back to America after being in?
I think that's a big part of it. One of the things that we don't do very well kind of is transition guys out of the military. I ended up volunteering for the City of Long Beach's Veterans Commission, and it's kind of one of the pillars of the strategic plan we're working on for City Council, is that there has to be a better way to help guys make this transition from having all of your friends and having your support system built in a very regimented way to kind of the open-endedness of civilian society and trying to reintegrate. I think that
horrible freedom.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's easy to feel hopeless, right? When your support system's gone,
Right.
and you find that you don't, when you're in the military, you have your specific niche. You do this job in this squad, right? Or you are this person. That's how you think of yourself. And even amongst the officer corps, right? They're the leader of these men. And then to take that away and presume that you're going to fill it immediately with something else in your life is...
You don't get that at Costco.
No, it's absurd.
Yeah.
So I think that we do a better job on that, it'll make a difference. But the despair is a big issue. And for other guys, it's kind of coping with some of the things you see and the delayed effects of war's awful. Like you see and do horrible things that aren't nice to speak about in polite company. And worrying about that and what its greater ramifications are, whether you're religious or not, it gets easy to be down about it. And if you give in to despair, it gets worse, and it leads to substance abuse and mental illness. And I think that's a big component of why we see the numbers we're seeing as far as suicides. It does seem to be worse in the special operations community. SEALs, Green Berets, Rangers, these kind of guys that volunteer for the high stress, high stakes type of stuff, they're extreme enough to not worry so much about the violence of ending their own life. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah. Where were you when Osama got captured?
I was here in Long Beach. I think it was, I'm trying to remember which year it was. It was still in President Obama's term, is that first or second term?
I think second.
I was still in either college or law school.
All right.
I remember watching the announcement on TV and feeling like that was a pretty major accomplishment for the United States.
Yeah.
I think up to that point, it probably honestly believed the man was dead under a mountain somewhere.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to be a very tall, very distinctive looking man in a region of the world where folks are short and nobody's seen the guy for 10 years.
And everybody in the world's looking for you.
Right? You might as well be Elvis.
Yeah. Right.